I'm Rod Goodyear. I think most of you have met me and Carol at one point.
I'm Carol Falender, and Rod and I are directing this program together. And both have elaborate expertise and experience in clinical supervision.
And we both thought a lot about the topic today, which is live observations. What we're going to do today is cover four topics. First of all, we're going to talk about the value of being able to directly observe supervisees' work. Then we're going to cover some of the ways in which supervisors can actually do that. We're going to talk then about what happens if you absolutely cannot do that. And then finally, we're going to end with the case for direct observation of your own work.
Why don't we talk first about why direct observation is so important?
We have an ethical mandate as supervisors with our clients, and that requires that we know what our supervisees are doing. And we're going to make a case later for the limitations of just relying on their reports of that. And the other big issue is feedback is really crucial to supervision. And yet feedback is only as good as the data we have for providing it.
One point is that supervisors are often at a loss to give feedback, and supervisees report there isn't much feedback given. But in fact, one of the root of that problem is that supervisors don't have actual data, behavioral data, to give feedback from. They just have generalities or impressions based on the supervisee's recounting. So direct observation provides actual behavioral anchored data.
So one of the issues that drives our discussion today is that most supervisors rely almost entirely on supervisees' self-reports of what they're doing. And yet there are two drawbacks to that. One is that supervisees often, almost invariably in fact, deliberately withhold some information from their supervisors. There have been a number of studies on that topic. Probably the classic was one by Lanani et al., showing the kinds of things that supervisees choose to withhold. So that 90% of supervisees report having withheld negative reactions to their supervisor. And there are other supervisor-related non-disclosures. Those are in kind of the lighter blue shadings. The stuff with the more yellow shading are ones that should be of particular concern to us because they concern the clients and the client well-being. So 43% of supervisees report not having provided information about just general observation about their client or negative reactions or attraction issues and so on. So this is a concern. But even when supervisees intend to be as honest as I feel comfortable, it's impossible to really capture in words a remembered event with any nuance at all.
I think this raises an important topic, metacompetence. And metacompetence is not knowing what we do not know. And things may happen in the session that they do not recognize, interactions, their own emotional response.
And there's some data that bear this out. A group of licensed psychologists were asked to remember main and more secondary events from therapy sessions. They had recall rates of about 42% for the main and 30% of the secondary events. So that's a pretty significant gap in memory.
The other issue, countertransference, of course. Sometimes really supervisees have not studied this in graduate school. They don't understand it, even sexual attraction, things like that, that a supervisor actually is providing something that the supervisee may not be aware of, and that is a huge risk management issue.
As a result of all this, most professional associations that have developed supervision standards have adopted the requirement or the recommendation that we directly observe our supervisees. And so, for example, APA's accreditation standards now require that each practicum and internship experience include at least some direct observation. Here in California, Assembly Bill 93, which was passed last year, stipulates that supervision includes, but is not limited to, and it lists 7 things, one of which is, quote, with the client's written consent, providing direct observation or review of audio or video recordings of the supervisee's counseling or therapy. That doesn't mandate it, but it certainly makes the case that it's part of what supervisors do.
Let's move ahead then to the forms of direct observation, including co-therapy, direct observation via video or live, audio or video recordings.
So let's take time out now and talk about when you're a supervisee, which of these methods did your supervisors use with you, if any? And what was your experience? And which of these are you using with your own supervisees?
What are some of the advantages of co-therapy as a means of supervision from your own experience and from your professional knowledge of the literature?
Co-therapy allows the supervisor to directly observe the supervisee's work and give direct feedback. The supervisor can serve as a model for both how they conceptualize what's going on and how they intervene. And it also has some challenge, particularly the tendency for especially beginners to simply recede passively into the background and let you, the supervisor, do the work. And when that happens, of course, supervisees lose the chance to test and confirm their own competence.
It also relates to the power differential.
Absolutely.
And the fact that the supervisor has so much power, and it may really compromise the therapeutic alliance, because then the client is confused about who is the therapist, and the supervisor has more power, more experience, and it may truly diminish the supervisee's role.
So that speaks to the importance of having a conversation ahead of time and really being clear on what your role is going to be with each other and how you're going to talk about them with each other.
Supervisees may also view it through a punitive lens. So very important to elaborate and explain some of the functions of direct observation and working together and learning from each other. Why don't we begin then talking about the mechanisms for live observation?
Live observation is something I think our family therapy colleagues have really given us a lot of good material for. They pioneered a lot of things like call-ins, so that the therapy is being watched and the supervisor calls into the session on the phone, for example, and has a conversation in front of the client, or reflection teams, or just sitting in. So Carol, you told me one of your participants in your class the other day talk about doing that as a supervision modality.
Yes, Adrian Jordan provided an example of sitting in with the supervisee off to the side at the back of the room, and how important that was in terms of the supervisee's development, but in this instance also in terms of quality control, ensuring that the level of competence of the supervisee is requisite for client needs. And it was a very powerful presentation, and I think gives us a model that could be useful in settings where they don't have the financial or technological background to have video, because I know that is a challenge in many county settings. We also have a sheet of paper that was developed by her team and her manager, which we'll be posting, about how they conduct the observation and what they're looking for.
I want to comment earlier about one-way glass versus video feed versus just being in the room, I guess.
Right.
So all of those are ways to be available in the present time with your supervisee. One-way glass is kind of the classic way. Technology is developing rapidly, so video feeds are easily used, or as pointed out, you can simply sit in. And the technologies also allowed us some techniques from the counselor education literature in particular to directly intervene. So the counselor education folks have talked about the bug in the ear technique, in which the supervisor is directly observing and the supervisee has an earbud, for example, in which the supervisor can give simple directives to the supervisee. Of course, the challenge would be not to overburden the supervisee with so much information it's not useful. So it'd have to be quick, short directives.
Rod, I think you did a study on that years ago that I think supervisees really didn't like that technique.
It's not one that I've used a lot, but it is there. And I think it has its use, especially for very beginning supervisees.
And PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy, it's the mainstay.
And more recently, the bug in the eye technique is analogous to that, only in this case, the supervisee is looking at a video screen above the client, and the supervisor can type simple directives. It really lends itself well to some of our technology options these days. So Our colleague Tony Rumanier, for example, was a psychologist in the counseling center at University of Alaska and was learning a new psychodynamic technique from a colleague who was in Washington, D.C. And they set it up so that Tony had a video monitor above the client. The supervisor was 4,000 miles away typing simple directives like pay attention to affect or things like that, just simple directives as he taught Tony his model of therapy, and then they would process it afterwards. So the bug in the eye is just one more tool, I think, for live supervision.
So why don't we consider some of these common situations and take a few minutes with your group. First of all, the supervisee arrives with 2 or 3 recordings of recent therapy sessions without having reviewed any of them beforehand. The supervisees made no decision about what session to discuss, and so spend several minutes telling the supervisor about each of the cases represented in the recordings. The supervisor eventually picks one session, and then the supervisor and the supervisee play the session from the beginning until something strikes the supervisor as important by some criterion. That's number 1. Number 2, the supervisor and the supervisee listen to or watch a recording for 20 minutes with the supervisee saying, gee, I guess the part I was talking about was further into the session than I realized. So take a few minutes and consider those and perhaps any other variants that have occurred in your setting.
The lesson in this is that you, the supervisor, need to know what you're looking for with the use of video and how you use it. Video can be used in a number of ways, and one is kind of a tight analysis, I guess is how I'd call it, where you're really scrutinizing interaction by interaction, or it can be used, I think, more broadly where video starts the conversation. And what I'd like to do is show you now a video of me doing supervision in more of that latter way. And as you watch it, please be thinking of how else I could have been using video, because we're going to talk about that shortly. You've got a video, I understand, of a college undergraduate. Tell me a little about her, what characteristics and what impressions you had, and then particularly what would be helpful as we work together today.
Okay, perfect. So she's a Caucasian female. She's a senior in her undergrad program. She came in and, as our initial session for the project, she seems to be well-grounded in what her long-term goals are, didn't necessarily present with any concerning symptoms. However, if I were to continue working with her, I would like to possibly explore more the idea of being able to express her emotions in a healthy way. I kind of feel like I got the impression that she kind of guards her feelings a little bit.
Brenda, you were saying that your impression was she could be more effective in expressing herself emotionally. So give me an example of what you're...
So definitely during the session we spoke about a health condition that her mom is currently struggling with. And I think not expressing her feelings is sort of as a protective barrier, kind of keeps her from facing reality. I think one of the things that we could work on is in reviewing a part of the session where we're discussing her mom's current health concern.
Well, let's, is it queued up?
My mom is having health problems. When I was in 3rd grade, she had breast cancer. And at that time, I couldn't really, understand it, so I don't think, I was very upset about it, or, knew what was going on. But currently, she, is going through, or she has, pre-cancer. Okay. So she's going through, surgery, but no, chemo.
I think it's really important, as I said earlier, about getting behavioral observations of supervisees. That is important. We see what happens, and both for pedagogic reasons that you can use as teaching moments, and also, as I said, for client care reasons. And there are different ways to approach that. I think one of the tensions in supervision in terms of direction is between giving the supervisee complete voice in where you're going versus having a sustained direction. And so I think it's important to have some sense of a contract with the supervisee of what you're working on so that they understand the skill set you're expecting. And because this was the consultation, we didn't have that piece. I think that's pretty conventional in supervision, that the supervisor will ask the supervisee to come in with something about their work with a client that was puzzling to them or interesting in some way, something that was a learning opportunity.
Why I showed you that is because the minute that I asked her if there was something that was currently stressing her, the session had gone, pretty well for the most part, and it was during this moment when she began talking about the current situation with her mom that she became obviously very upset and she's very hurt. However, she doesn't express these emotions to other people, and
so she's reacting with tears to you.
in a way that I wasn't expecting that either. So that kind of caught me off guard, and I'm not sure that I was as effective as I could have been with her.
Okay, so say more about that.
What I struggled with was that it had been 2 days since I had attended a funeral from a person that lost their battle to cancer. So that was particularly hard. It kind of triggered something in me, and I'm not sure if I was as objective as I could have been with her.
So what's your sense of what the effect was in terms of your behavior with her? How did it affect what you did with her?
I might have asked a couple more questions than I should have, just because I don't feel like I was as sensitive as I could have been, just because I knew that it was hard for her to express herself and for me to drill her with questions. And
so you kept it more of a cognitive level, it sounds like, than really pushed her to explore?
Right.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Can we see some more?
Oh, sure.
And for you to have to experience it again at an older age, you can definitely see things through a different perspective, and and you actually know what the meaning of breast cancer is. And the positive thing about this is that it's being taken care of, and it's.
So I kind of feel like you're being reassuring to her there.
Yeah.
And how does that feel as you look at it now?
I think reassuring is fine, but I think I did too much of because I was mostly doing it for my own comfort, because I was noticing her uncomfortableness.
And you just had this funeral 2 days before or whatever, so it's still a bit raw for you too.
Yeah.
There are a number of ways that you might use the video in supervision. So you might choose to review the most productive part of the session, the part of the session where the supervisee is really demonstrating the competence that you have in mind particularly well, and be able to talk about that, or maybe the most important part of the session, or the part of the session where the supervisee is struggling in a particular way. You can underscore any number of content issues, including, for example, the supervisee's use of metaphors, recurring themes, especially interpersonal themes. You can ask about confusing parts of the session. You can focus attention on particular interpersonal dynamics, strains, impasses, multicultural issues, and so on. And Carol sent me a link the other day to this I want to add, which is some creative ways to use audio and video recordings.
Some of the creative ways to use the audio or video are really fast forward to convey kind of a heightened image of the counselor and the client's body movements. And I think what Rod has been highlighting is the nonverbal behavior is incredibly important. And that might relate quite a bit to metacompetence, that supervisees aren't aware of what they're doing, how dismissive they look, or how disinterested they look, or how they're thinking about something else, all those kinds of things in their movements of their body. The second is, when using the video, turn down the audio, and I know Rod does this a lot, to try to fill in what is being said on the basis of nonverbals, and just simply to observe the nonverbals without the verbal. And then when using the video, cover the counselor on the screen and observe the client to guess what the client is doing, and vice versa. And this comes from Don Elsa Schnipes.
These strategies all suggest ways a supervisor might use a video recording in supervision. In some cases, for example, attention to nonverbals, there's an implicit goal. But Carol reminds us that we need to keep competencies at the forefront of our work.
Through the competence lens that we've been working on with the SCRP competencies, that if in fact before you review or begin the process you're talking about, you have a conversation with the supervisee about what particular competencies you're focusing on in the observation rather than simply fishing. So if in fact the supervisee has a multicultural competence or has a particular intervention competence, those could be the primary focus of the review so that the supervisee has more informed consent about what's going on, and it's more of a strategic intervention.
So to wrap this portion up, we have this table that we're putting up on the screen for you that summarizes some of the advantages of each of these forms of supervision. So for example, co-therapy allows you to see the supervisee, to be able to model behaviors, to intervene during the session. Live observation allows you to see and hear the supervisee and to intervene. Audio and video recording both allow you to hear and with video see, but also then the important task of being able to go in and microanalyze and really reflect on aspects of the session or really seize on those competencies that you're working on and think them through and talk them through and give specific feedback. So that's a quick summary of the various types of direct observation. We should talk about some of the issues and challenges of video recording. One thing is, of course, we would never record without having our consent from clients. And if we're working with kids, of course, not just the kids, but their parents as well. And you may need to coach your supervisees on asking for that permission. In our experience, how you ask is
Everything.
really important. Yeah. So if you come at it with an anxious, quavery voice, if you don't mind if I videotape you, do you? The supervisee is going to pick up on your anxiety and respond that way. So work with your supervisee at least initially on that.
But also you have to have the informed consent of your supervisees. They should know from the onset of their either job or placement that in fact this kind of review is going to be normative, so it's not a shock for them when it's introduced.
This really takes us back to the supervision contract, that initial conversation about how you're going to work together.
Right.
People have raised concerns about HIPAA, and I think that's such an important concern. So HIPAA doesn't preclude using video, but it does put some constraints on it. As your supervisees record sessions, there's some ways you can do that keeps you HIPAA compliant. For example, you can use video platforms like we use at the University of Redlands. Go React is the one we use there, which are HIPAA compliant, and the video feed goes directly to the cloud. It's protected that way. You could have the supervisee purchase an inexpensive video recorder to save sessions on memory cards. It can be safeguarded. You can save videos on an auto-encrypting portable hard drive. So there are a number of ways to do it. What you shouldn't allow your supervisees to be doing, of course, is pick up their cell phones and be using those in the session. Can be situations where, because of the clientele with whom you work or other factors of your work setting, the direct observation is especially challenging. And so I know you've thought a lot about this, Carol. What are some of your thoughts about some alternative ways of approaching this?
Well, I really like the one we talked about of someone sitting in. And I've done that myself when I was training director, when we had lack of access to video. I have sat in, and it's amazing how quickly people, like with videotape, people get used to it. These supervisees got used to it and really kind of almost forgot I was there off to the side. Another option is role play, and that is simply recreating or projecting what the next session is going to be, or having one of you be the supervisee and one of you be the supervisor, and shifting roles back and forth to have an in vivo situation. Another would be, of course, process notes. And many social workers are so skilled and competent at providing process notes, and is an important part of their training. I think it's been less used in other settings. It is an important mechanism for training to create the process note after the session and recreate the entire session. There are also case presentations, which are incredibly useful. Think about grand rounds in medical settings and how useful it is to have the supervisee present the case and to have a large number of people providing input on various aspects of it and reflect on it to move forward, especially in very perplexing situations. It's very, very helpful to have that kind of input. But although these are alternatives, I think it's clear that there really is no real possibility of anything else reaching the criteria of direct observation. That's why it was in the Assembly Bill 93 for BBS, Board of Behavioral Sciences, and that's why it's become a requirement for the American Psychological Association.
And we'd like to end then by looping it back to you all as developing supervisor. As you work to develop your skills as supervisors, it makes sense then to find opportunities to have people observe you and give feedback. So as we wrap this up, maybe Carol and I say goodbye at this point and end with you having a discussion in your class about how you're going to find a way to be observed at least once over the coming months as you develop as a supervisor. So it could be peer supervision groups or some mechanism like that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rod.
Thank you, Carol.